click the box on your screen. Let's see. We highly encourage the use of the chat feature in this lecture. So in the middle of your screen at the bottom, you should see the chat icon, and then you can type into that box anything that you would like throughout the course of the lecture. While we're going through the videos and everything, it'll be nice to be able to keep track of your questions as we go. So I encourage you to go ahead and type in any questions you have as we progress before we get to the question and answer time at the end. And then to kick us off, we are going to watch a brief illustrated history of the Volstead Act, and that is the act that legislated what prohibition was actually going to be. So I am going to go ahead and pull that up on my screen and then share it with you all. If there are any tech issues or any sound issues, go ahead and put that in the chat box and I'll make sure we can try to figure that out. But we tested this earlier and it did work. So, all right. So just give me 1 second and we will watch a brief illustrated history of the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act was the culmination of years of work by the temperance and prohibition movement in the United States. These movements were all about limiting or getting rid of alcohol in American society. After years of effort, the prohibitionists, or dries as they were called, finally defeated the anti-prohibitionists, or wets, in passing and ratifying the 18th Amendment.
The 18th Amendment, which banned intoxicating liquors, was championed by Senator Morris Shepherd, who would eventually become the longest-serving senator in Texas history. Often called the father of Prohibition, Morris argued that Prohibition was needed to defeat the Germans in World War I, would cause massive economic growth, raise the standard of living, and generally make America a wonderful place. He was so confident in the amendment that he declared there was as much chance of the 18th Amendment being repealed as a hummingbird flying to the planet Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail.
But the 18th Amendment was vague and mostly punted to Congress, giving them a year to figure out what prohibition actually was.
Enter Andrew Volstead and the Volstead Act, and possibly the greatest mustache in American history. The longtime Minnesota congressman with a solid reputation was the perfect face for the bill, and probably had no idea what he was getting into. There were a lot of ideas about what Prohibition and the 18th Amendment actually meant. The phrase intoxicating liquors meant different things to different people. Many felt that beer and wine, which were not technically distilled, were not banned under the amendment. Extreme prohibitionists, however, wanted alcohol completely gone, and it was this vision that the Volstead Act came to represent, although it wasn't Volstead who actually wrote it. The man behind the mustache was Wayne Wheeler and the Anti-Saloon League. Wheeler turned the Anti-Saloon League into arguably the first modern single-issue lobby group, and was very good at persuading, pressuring, and even blackmailing people into his way of thinking. Under his interpretation, everything with 0.5% alcohol or more was banned, much stricter than most people were expecting. Needless to say, many people were very unhappy about this, but fortunately for Wheeler, Volstead ended up with most of the hate mail.
Not only was the Volstead Act very strict, it also tried to be all-encompassing, and in some ways wasn't written very well. So much so that after the bill passed both the House and Senate, President Woodrow Wilson vetoed it. Wilson himself was very middle of the road on prohibition, and largely avoided the issue. There were several technical reasons why he vetoed the bill, but mostly he felt that it created a massive government bureaucracy, having potentially perpetual emergency war powers that violated civil liberties. But Congress overrode his veto. By this time, Wilson was far from the war-winning defender of democracy he had been, and his veto took place just a month after his stroke and after he had spent all political capital on his failed League of Nations plan.
In the end, Wilson would finish out the rest of his term as possibly the lamest duck president in American history. Wayne Wheeler became the unofficial czar of Prohibition without ever having been elected to anything. He refused any modification to the strict Volstead statutes, even as it became more difficult to enforce. his extremism finally caught up with him after he advocated the use of lethal poison in industrial alcohol, which led to the deaths of between 10 and 50,000 people. His defense, which amounted to saying drinkers didn't deserve to live, largely discredited him. Despite his long life and list of other accomplishments, Volstead was forever remembered only as the man who took away beer. He lived long enough to see the repeal of the bill that bore his name, but was so jaded by that time, he didn't comment one way or the other. Despite the repeal, the Volstead Act had and continues to have a major impact on American life.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that brief history of the Volstead Act. That is really instrumental. This is the 101st anniversary this year of the Act. We started this series last year on the 100th anniversary, and so that's kind of a foundational bit of information before we move forward with Josh's talk this year, which is going to be on the sweet side of Prohibition, and we're going to be looking at coffee, candy, and cola. So once again, thank you all for joining us. For those of you that have just come in, we're going to go ahead and air the lecture. And so this will be about 25-30 minutes. And then please type your questions in as we go. And then when we get to the end, we'll start going through all those questions and talk through some of the stuff that you guys are interested in. So thank you again. Let me pull up the lecture and then we will get started.
Hi, I'm Joshua Cole. I'm here at the beautiful historic W.H. Stark House in Orange, Texas, and specifically, I'm in the butler's pantry behind this gorgeous display of late 19th century china. And we've got some beautiful things here, and this is a great venue for the talk that we're going to have today. This is the second in our series of talks concerning the Volstead Act and Prohibition and how it affected America, and right here in Orange, Texas. And this is a great venue because we've got all these beautiful serving dishes, and what we're talking about today is really sweet. Quite literally, because so much of what we talk about when we talk about the Volstead Act and about Prohibition, we talk about what people couldn't have. We talk about the things like alcohol that were banned. We talk about all the illegal things people did to get alcohol. But we very seldom focus on the legal things that people tried to replace alcohol with. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is the sweet side of Prohibition, and that's going to be coffee, candy, and cola. But right at the outset, I want to say, could have said coffee, candy, cola, ice cream, chocolate, tea. We're talking about really all of this apparatus that was set up to try and replace alcohol in American life. And it wasn't just to replace alcohol in terms of the consumption. Keep in mind, you have to replace it culturally, socially, physically, economically, industrially, just practically. There's a lot of things that people did with alcohol can't do anymore. And that's really all a legacy of the Volstead Act specifically, because while the 18th Amendment does prohibit the sale of intoxicating liquors, it's the Volstead Act that defines what those liquors are. And what it defines it as is far more strict, far more stringent than many people were expecting. Andrew Volstead, the great mustachioed senator from Minnesota, he is the one the bill is named for, but it was really written by the fairly extreme prohibitionist Wayne Wheeler, who is the leader of the Anti-Saloon League. And they envision an alcohol-free society. And so the bill that he writes limits the sale of anything 0.5%, that's 0.5% or more. Basically saying no alcohol at all. And what they're trying to create is a totally alcohol-free society, which, keep in mind, isn't unheard of, isn't even unrealistic. Theoretically, at least about a fourth of the world's population, just in the Islamic world alone, is alcohol-free. So what we're going to be talking about today is the infrastructure, specifically the sugar infrastructure, they set up to try and replace alcohol. So, as I said, there's this whole infrastructure that they try and replace alcohol with. So this is a really fun ad. This is the ABC store. And this is a grocery store, one of these early grocery stores. I love the tagline, save so much you can buy a Ford. But this had a bakery, it sold meat, it sold vegetables, a really major revolution with how people consume goods, and really was a venue for all of these things we're going to be talking about. But the name is completely coincidental. This has nothing to do with the ABC laws, alcohol beverage control laws, which 17 states currently have state controls on the sale of liquor. Actually, Utah is the strictest. They control anything 4% and higher, so even beer and wine, and they can only be sold at state venues or ABC stores. That has nothing to do with anything here in Texas. You can see here which needs it most, and it's talking about the saloon keeper versus the housekeeper, the homekeeper. And it's literally listing all the things you can buy with the same amount of money you would normally spend on a fairly significant whiskey habit. A 10-cent drink a day habit, you're a pretty serious drunk. But it lists all the things you can have, and it lists things, not just staples like wheat and beans and potatoes, but it lists things that a generation before would have been real luxuries. Sugar, coffee, bananas, all of these things that you can get very cheaply, you can now buy instead of alcohol. One of the reasons that this is available is, and it's very important to say this at the beginning, while we're obviously focusing on the impact of Prohibition, there's a lot of things that are happening all at the same time. You have the Spanish influenza is starting to hit. You have World War I has happened. You have industrialization. You have new technologies. You have all these things happening. The uniquely American part of this experience is Prohibition. What's interesting about all of these things that are being offered, especially the tropical fruits, sugar, bananas, coffee, those are now available to Americans at such a cheap price because a generation before this, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, America goes through its only major overseas imperial expansion. During the Spanish-American War and just before that, Hawaii becomes a part of the United States territories. Puerto Rico, we get major control of Cuba as well as much of Central America. And of course, we get the Philippines. All of these are major sugar, coffee producers, and that means American companies have a large amount that they can sell cheaply. It also means there's a lot of companies that have a vested interest in replacing alcohol in the American diet. And so, we're going to talk about how Big Candy, Big Coffee, Big Cola do push their products specifically as a replacement to alcohol, and how Big Beer, Big Wine, Big Alcohol suffers because they just don't really have a good response that isn't beer's okay. So all these things are listed, and certainly you could never replace alcohol with just one thing. It's two major part. There's also, keep in mind, when we talk about alcohol, we're talking about wine, beer, whiskey, schnapps. The list goes on and on of the different types. So each have a different role in society, a different purpose, and so you have these different luxury items, these different sugars that are filling that void. Coffee, though, of course, is the one we have to talk about really at the beginning, because coffee is the great anti-alcohol. It's the only thing that really comes close to alcohol, possibly tea, but really coffee is the only thing that comes close to alcohol and having the same social significance and the same kind of culture around it. Coffee is the primary drink of the Islamic world, which is, even today, the primary teetotaling non-alcohol societies. There are others, but coffee is this great stimulant. It has caffeine. And also, it's got a great smell. There's a great tradition around it. You can really enjoy a lot of things socially with coffee. And coffee was nothing new. Coffee was something that Americans were very familiar with, although it was a luxury item that was becoming far more accessible to far more Americans in far greater quantities. But you have brands, Folgers goes back to 1850. You've got newer brands like Maxwell House, 1892. But again, they're really opening up coffee and marketing it in a mass way. The other thing that coffee does is coffee is the one drink that most replace as alcohol in restaurants. This is a major, major thing because, and I'd love to do a separate talk on just the effect of prohibition on restaurants, because in many ways, the modern diner concept, the modern American restaurant, comes out of this period where restaurants have to move away from dependence on alcohol sales to cheap, plentiful food, often supplemented by coffee or cola, as we'll talk about later. And of course, beverage drinks is still a major element of the food industry. And that all really dates to this period, replacing alcohol as the primary drink in restaurants. And coffee plays a major role in that. Coffee also greatly increases. You know, it's a bit of a bad stereotype. If you've got a bad hangover, what do you want? Lots of coffee. Basically, what does the national hangover of the 1920s begin with? Lots of coffee. When you can't drink alcohol, you have to have coffee. The thing about coffee is it is fairly adult drink. It's not something that kids normally drink, and so spaces that drink coffee tend to be more of an adult space. And I think that's an aspect. So much of the Prohibition movement focused on family values, all the family together. You know, the fathers drinking away all the food for money, all the money for food, all the money for clothing. But coffee really lets us create this adult space and this more adult society within an alcohol-free world. And it's interesting. I found this photo in Portland, Texas, and it's really great. This is Bakersfield town site, 1929, sort of late Prohibition era. And it's a great Texas scene. You can see the dirt street. It's got the low wooden buildings. I mean, you replace those cars with horses, and this could be any kind of, Western scene. And you can see the classic storefronts. And of course, what's prominent? Not the saloon, it's the coffee shop. That is what has replaced it. And that's a major part of this, is not only replacing alcohol in the American diet and in American habits, but replacing it physically. How can we have a meeting space for adults without alcohol? And that's where coffee comes in. So Prohibition posed a lot of new challenges that no one was expecting. One of the challenges was the extreme nature, just completely getting rid of all alcohol. There are a lot of things that alcohol is in that isn't drinks. There's a lot of uses for it commercially, in other manufacture of other goods. So it really did cause a major problem. This is a great little article I stumbled upon almost completely by accident in the Orange Leader from 1921 on October. So about almost 2 years, not quite 2 years into this experiment. And it's really pointing out this major issue, a couple major issues. One of which is that the Volstead Act was really complicated, and partly because it gave so much power to local authorities to regulate alcohol in their areas. So you have towns making rules, you have states making rules. This South Dakota rule that banned the sale of lemon extract. I don't know what they were thinking. If people were getting drunk off on lemon extract, I feel like that's a really hard and, dare I say, dangerous way to try and get drunk. But it does show this broader trend to just try and get rid of alcohol together. And it causes problems. I love this quote. "But if the hired man will undertake to brighten his life with lemon extract, shall father and the boys be cut off from lemon meringue pie?" And of course, that's a huge issue. I mean, when Prohibition passed, no one said I couldn't have pie. So you can see how this really does cause problems. But like any good Americans, no, not with the research squad on the job. They're basically promising, hey, we're going to innovate, we're going to experiment, we're going to come up with all new things. And I think this is one of the most important aspects out of this whole experiment with Prohibition that really does affect the American food culture. It really does make Americans comfortable with experiment and making new things and trying to find new ways of doing things and really doing a lot of things to food that other places didn't feel the need or wanted to do. And so there's all this demand for all these new things, especially in sugar. You can really see all these new ways to use technology to replace what's all been done before. New emulsifiers, new chemicals, new way of making old things. Another part in this same section here is, I love this, there were 275 million gallons of ice cream consumed in the United States in 1920. Every young man with 3 or 4 young lady friends imagines he is paid for all except for 1 or 2 gallons of that amount. Again, this really shows you how big a change this is. Ice cream is one of the substitutes. Ice cream parlors replace bars as places for you to take someone on a date. But moreover, there is a revolution that goes on. Now, both of these early pioneer candies were actually created slightly before Prohibition goes into effect, but they're part of this broader movement of creating viable substitutes. And they each play a different role. We have the venerable Tootsie Roll and the Goo Goo Cluster. These are 2 classic Great American candies, both pioneers. The Tootsie Roll is a really interesting experiment in a lot of ways. Generally speaking, you'll see it listed as toffee-like, a taffy-like thing. I found one source that actually listed it as an edible wax. It's a really interesting thing, but what it is it's a candy scientist, a chemist's attempt to make a stable chocolate candy substitute that won't melt, that will last a long time, which that's what Tootsie Rolls do. You can see one of the early ads actually says, guaranteed not to melt. You can see this ad that we have up is advertising as a military candy. It's stable, send it to the trenches. So it's a really incredible thing, but more importantly, it's the very first individually wrapped penny candy in America and really opens up this whole world. Keep in mind that at this time, most candy was locally produced by the local confectionery shops or the local bakery, and it was sold out of big glass jars. Didn't last very long, not very sanitary, but because of the influenza epidemic and because of some other factors with transportation, it becomes more and more important to individually package those things. The Goo Goo Cluster was originally sold in these same ways. It comes out of Nashville, Tennessee, and it is the very first combination candy bar. And what this means is it's not just pure chocolate, it's not just chocolate and nuts, it's actually chocolate, nuts, nougat, caramel. There's a whole bunch of things in there. And not so much with the Tootsie Roll, but the Goo Goo Cluster, along with a lot of other candy bars and candies of the time, the Hershey's bar that comes out in 1930, the Milky Way came out shortly before it, both those by Mars. These are actually marketed as a quasi-health food dietary supplement. Keep in mind, beer was a major part of a lot of working people's diets. That's a lot of sugar you're not getting anymore. And this is actually advertised. One of the early ads for the Goo Goo Cluster is a nourishing lunch for a nickel. I mean, that's kind of crazy. But if you think about it today, we have a major problem with sugar in our society. 100 years ago, while starvation wasn't an issue, malnutrition, and especially for children and working people, was. So these rich, fatty, nutty, caramely combination chocolate bars were a viable nutrition supplement. You can see this even today with Snickers advertising. They still kind of hold on to this roots. They advertise, if you're, you get angry when you get hungry, here, have a Snickers, it satisfies. That's very much a part of the roots with these things, and you can still see that today. And of course, all of these things come together in the candy shops and in the soda jerks and in the confectionaries. So on this slide, we have 2 ads for 2 of Orange's local confectionaries. And the terms vary regionally. The term here locally appears to have been confectionery. Candy kitchens also used quite a bit. But, these are soda shops. These are your diners. You can see the Deluxe Confectionery and Cafe. So this is a really interesting thing that develops. And we can see all of our triad come together. I did not find any evidence that Adams sold coffee, but I do know that Deluxe Confectionery Cafe also sold coffee. So these become these big sort of dispensaries for all of this sweetness. And of course, it's ice cream, candy, and soft drinks. A big underpinning, and the thing that is most directly rooted, and possibly one of the biggest continuing influences on the world of America's experimentation with Prohibition, is soda, specifically Coca-Cola, which I'll talk more about in a second. But these sodas, they're so linked because everything else has origins elsewhere. Obviously, candy existed before. Obviously, coffee has a very ancient history. Soda, however, really is a very modern creation. They more or less all come out of this kind of snake oil salesman, miracle cures, chemists are making. They're putting all these crazy things together, and this will cure that. All of them cured impotence, in case you were wondering. But yeah, they're doing all these things, and it's in this sort of pseudoscience health world. It's worth noting that things like ginger ale and root beer have a similar, if slightly different and slightly older evolution. We're really talking about colas here, and I will just do a shout out to the big three. They're all from the South, which is actually, I think, a very important thing to point out. The Prohibition movement was strongest and began earliest in the South. And so we have, of course, Pepsi from my home state of North Carolina, from New Bern. It was originally Brad's drink in 1898, and it was created specifically because the local soda shop owner felt that Coke was charging way too much, wouldn't give him a deal, so he made his own. So Pepsi, from its very origin, has been created to fight the evil Coca-Cola empire. Now, of course, we couldn't possibly say anything about cola without at least making a nod to Dr. Pepper, the admittedly smaller of the big three sodas, but it is also Waco, Texas born, and technically speaking, was available one whole year before Coca-Cola. However, not nationally until about 15, 20 years later. So the story of Coca-Cola really is the story of how soda dominates the world. And it has a very complicated and very interesting development. And it's heavily linked to the temperance movement in the United States. Here's a really early ad, and when Coca-Cola was first put out, it was advertised when it first emerged in its non-alcoholic form, which I'll talk about in a second. It was advertised as the great temperance beverage. It's really marketed to fill this niche. This is this great, healthy, beneficial thing that is completely harmless, no alcohol. It's the great temperance drink. It's worth noting that in this early version, it still had a lot of cocaine in it. So they took the alcohol, then the cocaine. But all of this really develops from, like many great American classics, a French tradition. So John Pemberton, who's this really interesting former Confederate doctor, he's a colonel, he's kind of your classic snake oil salesman. He's always developing these elixirs that cure all these things. He develops his own version of Vin Marini. And Vin Marini was the brainchild of Angelo Marini, and it was a coca or cocaine-infused wine. Pemberton develops his own version that includes caffeine from the coca root. And so he markets his first drink very creatively. It's Colonel John Pemberton's French wine coca nerve tonic. Now, what happens though is he's based in Atlanta, and Atlanta and the county in that area is one of the very first to go dry. It actually goes dry in the mid-1800s. So what does our enterprising snake oil salesman John Pemberton do? He takes the alcohol out and he rolls with it. He starts marketing it as a temperance beverage. Don't drink that evil alcohol. Here's this great, beneficial thing for you to drink. It actually still more or less contains cocaine in it up until 1904 when they finally take that out. And they realize that the sugar syrup they developed for hiding the flavor of cocaine and alcohol actually is really good by itself. And they start selling it as such. And so Coca-Cola emerges in its final form in 1886, and it really starts marketing and really starts aggressively creating the space for cola. That all these other all these other companies start rushing into. But Coca-Cola, it's the first, it's the biggest, they wield the biggest hammer, and they really do crush most of the competition. Actually, in a series of lawsuits in the 20s and 30s, they sue most of them for copyright infringement and different things like that. Even the classic Coca-Cola bottle shape was all a way of sort of beating out would-be competitors, having a unique Coca-Cola shape. And so this is where we get to, when we get to the 20s, we have all of these various replacements that are ready to come in, and they just really explode. And we can see how much Coca-Cola and the other soda companies really just flood into American life. So these two photos are worth explaining before we move on. They're really great little capsules of American history. First, the two guys in their stall. This is actually a fair stall, and it's basically an outdoor bar. You can see it's completely replaced beer in the traditional fairgrounds area. And it's going everywhere. You know, once it gets bottled and moves out of the soda shop, Coca-Cola is transported everywhere. You saw the photo at the very beginning, a slide, you know, it shows this cowboy with his truck just loaded with the Coca-Cola bottles. This other one's great, and this really is the one sort of Prohibition photo I will add in here. This lady here with this sort of sheepish smile, what you can't really tell very easily in the photo is her cane is actually hollow and filled with some kind of alcohol that she is re-alcoholing her Coke with. And it's worth noting that, you know, one of the big uses of a lot of these sodas is, to this day as chasers, their origins in being a vehicle for alcohol mean, guess what? They're a pretty good vehicle for alcohol. So the classic rum and Coke lives on. But yeah, I love that photo. Again, that sheepish smile. And again, it shows you ultimately these replacements don't really work, but they do have a massive impact on American society. And we'll see that really in the next final slide I want to show you. Now, this is a wonderful article I found, and this is from mid-1933. It's again Orange Leader, and this is from July, so it's a summer ad, and it's a classic celebrity ad. This is a celebrity diet, actually. We have a major jazz singer here, Annette Henshaw, and she is basically the voice of the 20s and 30s. You listen to any of her music, it is the 20s and 30s. She is not a name that we think of today commonly, but she was a major star of her day, and this is explaining her new diet that she has to go after the new craze, which is curves. Curves are in. She needs curves. And so how is she going to get those curves? Well, you know, she's got her coffee, and it's important to note that one of her major sponsors is Maxwell House, so she's sponsored by Maxwell House. So of course she has cream in her coffee, but more than that, she drinks 2 to 3 full glasses of straight cream every day. And this is all to help her gain weight as quickly as possible, and it says she's gained 10 pounds in many days, and she's up to a whopping 97 pounds. What I love about this is it really encapsulates everything that's going on. Now, this is right at the end of the Prohibition experiment. In fact, a few months before this, Roosevelt has already signed legislation, the first legislation to modify the Volstead Act that will allow some low-grade beer to sell. But the 21st Amendment is in full process. The end of Prohibition is near, but you can see American society has already been totally changed. We have a situation where one of, if not the biggest singers of her generation, is on a diet of straight cream, and that's okay. But it also shows you that maybe straight cream is what she needed, because she was apparently only 87 pounds. We often think about size as height, and especially, you know, I have a background in colonial houses, and everyone's always like, oh, they were so short back then, weren't they? They were so short. It's not height, it's size. We're much bigger people, and that really has to do with the very rich, sugary diet that we have. And this is the period where that comes from. This is where we introduce huge amounts of new sugar into our diet. By 1933, it's okay for her to be drinking nothing but cream. It also shows, you know, it's a coffee company that is sponsoring her. But what's she drinking that cream out of? Coca-Cola shaped glass. So it really shows all these big features that have happened and have really made America a fundamentally different place when the diet comes. When alcohol does come back into society, as we saw that later, pouring her rum into her alcohol into her Coke, all these things don't go away. We're still eating ice cream. We're still drinking Coke. We're still eating all this candy. So the alcohol is just added back on top of it. And alcohol, while it does come back with a vengeance, never really gains the prominence it had before in American society. It always is one of the things in this much more complicated food sugar universe. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and we'll open up to questions.
All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed. So we left plenty of time for questions at the end. And so I will read off the first couple with Josh, and then we can also, after we get past these couple, if you would like to unmute and ask any questions, or maybe like raise your hand, give us a nod, we'll go from there. So I'm going to slide the screen over to Joshua. Hello. All right, so for our first question we have from Linda, why was coffee more popular than tea to replace liquor in America?
Okay, so this actually goes back very, very early to the founding of the American Republic. Tea was associated with Imperial England. And so obviously, you've got the Boston Tea Party. And so tea has always not had the place, at least the public place, and I think more importantly, the ideological place in American society, because it was associated with the empire. Coffee, however, was, the coffee bars of Boston and New York were these great places where, Jefferson and Adams and Franklin all got together to discuss great American freedom. So coffee was the American drink. And tea is very prevalent, but tea is much more regional than coffee. And tea really isn't very American. Coffee is. And so that's really why coffee has that prominence. I mean, other societies that don't have alcohol, tea is prominent over coffee, especially in South Asia and Southeast Asia. However, in the American context, coffee is the only thing that really has that same social connotation. Tea just never takes on here in the same way. And I think a lot of it is we're still at heart a rebellious colony. And they drink tea in England. Americans drink coffee.
All right, and then we have, did the coffee drinkers in the early days of Prohibition drink their coffee black or with cream and sugar? Team cream and sugar is me.
Yeah, cream and sugar. And I think that's another thing too that I mentioned a little bit at the end of the talk is the facility for producing all these things greatly increases. So in part, Henshaw can have a diet of straight cream because she can get cream easily. This is the heyday of sort of the milkman delivering fresh dairy products every day. So there's a whole infrastructure to produce these things and to people have access to it. So yeah, coffee increasingly becomes more additives, more creamers, more modifiers. I think many people would still have drunk it black, but there's also a lot of, again, technological experimentation. Towards the end of this period, we get true instant coffee, and it's technically after Prohibition is repealed, but all that is being developed. There are earlier versions of instant coffee that are available, but all this is happening at the same time. So the more that coffee has prominence, the more you have creamers and things like that develop to fill the need.
And now we have coffee that is mostly cream and then just a little bit of coffee. So it's, it's come full circle. Kim asks, she says her father didn't like them drinking Coke when they were growing up. And she asks if there was no alcohol available for cooking during Prohibition either.
Yeah, basically the simple answer is no. There were, however, a lot of ways around it. And people did get it, but legally speaking, for just cooking, no, it was technically illegal. And industrial alcohol was hard to get. And that's mentioned, it was mentioned in the video that Wayne Wheeler got in trouble for poisoning industrial alcohol. That was alcohol that was used largely in food production, but in a lot of other things on a commercial level. But the bigger problem with the Volstead Act is it really did eliminate a lot of subsidiary use of alcohol that no one was expecting. Like the idea that, alcohol infused extracts would be banned. No one had any idea that was going to happen. So it did affect a lot of cooks. There were technically exemptions for medical use, so you could literally get a prescription for alcohol. There were, the other major area was religious use. So you could actually use, you as a priest, as a rabbi, as a minister, could get a license for liquor for religious uses. And this did take, obviously for communion and things like that. But if you think about, especially in the Jewish faith, the use of alcohol is much more in sort of ceremonial dinners and things like that. So there were ways around it, but that's one of the big failings of the Volstead Act is you wind up homemaking. Your otherwise perfectly law-abiding Italian mother has to, deal with a criminal to get her wine for her grandmother's recipe. So that does cause. I mean, that's one of the ultimate reasons why it fails is that extremism.
Right, tying it to the Stark family, can you talk a little bit about how the Stark and Fletcher families responded to these changes brought around by Prohibition and access to coffee, tea, hot chocolate, candy, ice cream, etc.?
Oh yeah. So the family themselves, they were, and this gets into a complicated discussion we talked a lot more about in the first thing, but the family themselves were largely of German extraction, especially the money, the lectures. They were also raised Lutheran, and so they would have fallen more along the lines of the wet camp just by demographics. And I think, and WH was actually, his brother owned a bar. He was involved with that as a silent partner for a while. So they were part of the alcohol culture. However, for a lot of complicated political reasons, and mostly for business reasons, they became very orthodox. And the orthodoxy increasingly became prohibition is good, alcohol is bad. And so they were sort of mute on the subject largely, with the big exception that WH's father literally led the prohibition forces in Orange during the early 20th century. So, but the main core of our family were kind of mute on the issue. But they also did get involved with a lot of companies. One of the big ones, and this actually relates to the next one, sweet tea, and things like that. One of the big companies they got involved with was the the electric light and ice company. And what's interesting is that company, we think of electricity as the big deal. Well, in the ads, the thing they really push is the ice. And the fact that you can have fresh ice and continual ice throughout the year, that makes things like sweet tea and iced tea much more viable. And that's where that drink really emerges from more. Um, but they were involved in the infrastructure part of it. Refrigeration was a huge role in making a lot of these things possible. You obviously can't have ice cream without ice. You obviously can't have all these dairy products without some kind of refrigeration. Even with pasteurization, which stabilizes milk, you still need some degree of refrigeration, ice boxes. And so that's a whole nother part. Whenever you do research for a thing like this, you find 16 other topics you don't want to talk about. Just the refrigerator alone made a lot of this possible. Fresh fruit, milk, things like that. That alcohol historically had been used because you don't need refrigeration. And alcohol was historically healthier. This improved transport technology and infrastructure made things like iced tea, made things like ice cream possible and available to not just the super wealthy. I mean, we have accounts of Roman emperors sending slaves to the top of Vesuvius for ice treats. That's obviously not everyone's getting that. That's emperors. So that's the big thing that technology allows in the first half of the 20th century is for everyone to have access to this. And so there's more viable replacements for alcohol, and alcohol isn't as vital as it once was.
Right. We have Coke was more expensive, and that is how Pepsi came to be. Do you know which one was America's beverage of choice between the two at this time?
Coke Coke dominates, and there's a lot of regional, and it's important to point out there are hundreds of small cola companies that pop up that eventually Coke's largely incorporates and smashes. There's a half dozen in Texas alone. Texacola was a thing, and then there's a lot of like really slight knockoffs like Coca-Cola with K's, spelled only with K's, and that's the stuff that Coke really went after in a big way. Um, Coke really was the first soft drink. Pepsi was regional, and really didn't take off until the middle of the Depression. And it's again part of the lore within the Coke, because Pepsi eventually becomes a great competitor of Coke. That takes a long time, and part of the lore in that competition is that Coke had the option to buy Pepsi like 2 or 3 times and didn't think it was worth their time. Where Pepsi really breaks into the market is during the Depression. They're the first to sell large bottles. So all the way through most of the cola history, you got your Coke either from 6-ounce bottles, and that was the only way to get packaged, or you got it from your local fountain. And but Pepsi actually started bottling in used wine bottles and started selling family packs. So now whenever you go to the grocery store and you see those big like liter, 2-liter bottles, that's Pepsi's contribution. That's what ultimately saves them. And then they are able to build up, and then they enter into this really complicated, the cola wars of the 60s and 70s. They do the blind taste testing, and they start building their market that way. But yeah, and again, it really was a very different world. This was mostly syrup that was sold, and those prices were often controlled by local distributors. So it might be that the local guy was charging more than what was fair. But are there any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. So the I think it's a temperature thing. I think that's what.
Explain the question.
Explain. Oh yeah.
Yes.
So I understand how coffee is considered to be more American over hot tea. How do you explain then the rise of sweet tea, iced tea? It's an environmental thing. Ice and air conditioning later changed the way the South lives, and so the South embraces the sweet, cool drink because it's just hotter. And I think that's really where you see that cultural and regional difference. Also, tea actually can grow in parts of the South, so it can be locally produced. And I think that's why you have that tradition grow in contrast to the North. And just think in general, a lot of things that are Southern associated are sweeter, sugarier, and a lot of that has to do with the heat and the climate.
All right, so we've talked about tea, coffee, and cola. What about the rise of ice cream companies and other sweets manufacturers?
Oh yeah, and there were a bunch, and they're often very linked. What really happens increasingly is centralization and industrial scale. So most of this, even the cola industry, was largely based on small scale mom and pop shops. So we talked about here we had the confectionaries. There are dozens of names that refer to very similar type things: pop shops, Coke shops, ice cream parlors, ice cream bars, confectionaries. They're all kind of the same world. The one thing they all had in common was they were local. What happens more and more as you get into the 20s is there's bigger profits. And also as things become individually packaged, it makes more sense to make those in larger factories. And because of the transportation system, you can then ship those out. And so all of these different companies, the better the infrastructure gets, the more refrigerated train cars, the more packaging technology develops, the more centralized and factory-based the industry becomes, and it moves away from the small mom and pop shops. I mean, the Google cluster, for instance, originated as a local shop making it, and then they marketed it, then they opened a factory. So you probably had Google cluster things all over the country being made. Keep in mind, this is all happening at the same time. People are all working with the same imperative. And so there's a lot of sort of parallel innovations. And so you do have a lot of that going on. I think that is what's interesting is you really see who's more entrepreneurial with the companies that make it. And especially the candy companies, they have some really incredible stories. Hershey's and Mars, the founders, have some great backstories. There's also some really cutthroat, pretty crazy stories, especially in the Mars family. The inner civil war within the Mars family for control of the Mars chocolate empire. I mean, there was a sort of semi-illegitimate son who went off to do better than his father and created a competitive Mars company. Like, there's some really complicated, fun history to it. And the candy barons, the sugar barons, are not talked about in the same way that the Rockefellers and the oil barons and the Carnegies are talked about. In some ways, they're just as successful, and in some ways, they're more brutal. I mean, say what you want about Rockefeller. I mean, the Doles, Pineapple was one who was conquering governments. So this whole sugar industry too. There is a lot about that rise, but a lot of it is linked to technology.
If anyone has a favorite vintage candy, please comment in the chat box because I have not had a Goo Goo Cluster or anything of that nature. And so I always find the older candies fascinating. We do have a question from Linda. Is it true that ice cream parlors started in dentists / doctors' offices?
Yeah, and that is because that's where soda starts. And so all these things build on. What you often have is you have someone who starts selling soda, then they'll start selling candy, then they'll start selling ice cream. That's how these things evolve. But yeah, no, it was originally chemists and doctor shops were the ones that had the technology to make this stuff and formulate it. It also shows the very medical roots of a lot of these things. A lot of these things were originally quasi-medical, or in the case of Coca-Cola, was actually a medical tonic. That was how it was marketed. That's how it was created. And you would be prescribed Coca-Cola or prescribed a tonic for your nerves. And so that's where a lot of this comes out of drug. Well, that's even today. Drugstore is another one of the classic places where you would get your ice cream, get your candy. That's still a very American thing, that a lot of this stuff originated in drugstores. So yeah, that origin is more or less accurate.
Time for a couple more.
Yeah, we have it's not quite 12, so we have maybe one or two more.
Okay, you mentioned sending candies to the troops. Were the U.S. soldiers able to get alcohol from the countries they were in? And did Prohibition put pressure on the abroad soldiers to abstain? Ooh, that's excellent.
It's a very good question. And actually, a lot of this centers around the military. A lot of the Prohibition movement, the big breakthrough they have in the late 1900s, or in that late teens period, is that Prohibition is initially pushed through as a war measure. And so there actually is a lot of concern for limiting alcohol to military personnel specifically. So actually, almost all bases were already dry by the early 20th century. And the reason that Orange, for instance, when Orange finally went dry in 1918, that actually was because of a law that said you could not have a bar or sell alcohol within 10 miles of a military camp or base. So it was actually because of a military restriction why Orange initially went dry. And so, yeah, there was tremendous pressure for U.S. troops when they were overseas not to drink. In terms of combat troops, so for the late, in 1918 and 1917 in France, there was sort of a live and let live policy. It wasn't really that. It was war, you do what you do, but at least on bases and in the post-war period, there was major pressure for U.S. troops not to drink. And that's one of the reasons why U.S. U.S. cantinas and things pushed so many things like Coke, coffee, cigarettes especially. They were trying to push alternatives to alcohol. And so yeah, the U.S. military was one of the vehicles, actually you could argue, it's the vehicle that's used to force Prohibition.
Right. All right. Well, to answer the last question that we have about if the Q&A will be recorded and if the link can be passed to out-of-state friends, absolutely, 100%. Please pass this along. I will have the recording done and edited together by early next week. So anyone who attended or who had signed up, I will email the link directly to you, and then it'll also be archived on our website. So thank you guys so much for spending the lunch hour with us. We really appreciated it. And we hope you enjoyed this talk. We will see you next time. I'm going to let Josh wave goodbye.
Thank you so
Goodbye.
much.
Goodbye.
Have a great day.